Howdy, folks. This is Dan Gross, and welcome to Extended Harmony for Outside In Music. Outside In Music is both a record label and a jazz media company that connects jazz artists to their passionate fan bases. Please visit our website to find out more about what we do. Check out our latest videos and podcasts. Joining us today is Yoshie Fruchter, a New York-based oud player. Now, Yoshie is the leader for a band called Sandcatchers, which I had the pleasure of seeing in my hometown. So today we're going to talk to him about what an oud is, how he started playing the oud, Sandcatchers, and his latest album. Yoshie, thanks for joining me today, man.
Thanks so much, Dan. Thanks for having me.
So you have a German last name. And your area code is not from New York. So are you originally from New York? Where are you from?
I'm from a town called Silver Spring, Maryland, which is just north of Washington D.C. And grew up there in a Jewish community. And I went to University of Maryland, so kind of stayed in the area through school, and then came to Brooklyn right after I graduated in 2005 and haven't looked back.
All right, so you've been there a long time.
Yeah. No, it's I knew pretty early on, in at least once I left high school and got into college, started discovering music and you know, just that the culture scene in New York was where I wanted to be.
Yeah. And we'll talk about your time in New York in a minute here, but one thing I definitely am curious about is you mentioned you grew up in a fairly Jewish community. So for you growing up, what were some of your early musical influences that said to you, "Oh, hey, I want to pursue music"?
Sure. Well, I guess I'll start with the fact that you know, I think sort of Jewish culture in general, but certainly like the family that I grew up in, and you know, different people that I sort of found along the way, I guess, just to reference the album, I guess. Yeah. But it's the musical culture in Judaism is really interesting and really cool. It's very tied to prayer, and we grew up religious, and so we went to synagogue, and I learned about how to you know, lead services and sing synagogue music, and what's interesting about it is that you know on Saturday, you know, and Friday night and Saturday, people don't play instruments or listen to music on record or anything like that. So it's the only music that can be made in that time is through your voice. So there's a focus on really on singing, on simple melodies that people can kind of sing together that often don't have words actually. Yeah. And so I think that for me, like that, and I only really discovered this in the more recent past, but just how much of those experiences shape the way that I write and the way that I experience and play music. You know, I think that the way that I approach composition especially is really focusing in on something small that can be sort of like the heart of a composition, and like I don't always necessarily feel the need to build it out too much. So like my songs are often like very, you know, fairly simple and focused around one or two sort of melodic sections, and I think that comes directly from, you know, those kinds of experiences, singing these Jewish prayer melodies and Hasidic melodies and things like that. So, but you asked about what did you ask about? You asked about how it informed my professional life, I guess. So another thing is that my dad is a professional musician. He's a doctor, but he actually plays. He has like a klezmer, like a Jewish klezmer band down in Maryland that I did my first gigs with actually.
Playing guitar.
So it's like playing guitar, yeah, and you know, most of my friends, you know, who were playing music at the time, you know, it's like, you know, or that I've met since, you know, its first gig was at, some dive bar in whatever the downtown part of where they grew up. For me, it was like a bar mitzvah at the local synagogue. That was like my first gig. So, and it's funny because it translated to living here. I still, do a lot of that kind of work. So I think that was a big part of it. My dad being a musician, and my mom is she's an educator, but an art teacher, and she's very into the idea of the arts as a basis for education, and so we grew up with a lot of like focus on the importance of the arts in general. And my older sister is a writer. My next youngest sister is a puppeteer and director.
Wow.
And my youngest sister is a rabbi, actually, but she incorporates the arts into a lot of her stuff. So it definitely, it struck a chord for sure. No pun intended.
This is actually fascinating that you bring this up. This is only in one instance was this intentional. Another great New York-based player I've had on my show before, Ike Sturm, bass player, and runs the... Yeah, okay, so Ike. And I find this, and I've had a Danny Rubin on from Marvin, and he grew up, and is Jewish as well. And I find this a really interesting sort of intersection between these two things. Like anything else in life, a religion is just something that you practice. I mean, there are people for whom football is their religion because they practice it, they play it, and they watch it on Sundays. And I find this intersection between religion and music really interesting, and I find it particularly interesting now that in our sort of global culture in general, religion kind of is taking a back seat. And you mentioned the older you get, the more you realize how those formative years really affected you and your music, and particularly doing the religious music and listening to Sandcatchers. I wouldn't use the word religious in sort of what we would think in the typical way of religion. I mean, you're not preaching a message, but it's something this little grain of something you said earlier about when you compose, you take this just little idea and you kind of meditate on it. And so, I mean, these two things must have a really interesting intersection for you. I mean, being both a jazz musician who travels all the time and does all these different gigs and has your own projects, with being a practicing Jew as well. I'm just curious how those two things sort of intersect in your daily life.
Sure. Yeah. And just to clarify too, my Jewish practice has evolved since I grew up. Like I'm not observant in the same way that I was growing up, although it certainly informed a lot of the way I do things now. But yeah, and I think with regards to your point about the religion, I find it really interesting too, especially, my experience being in, Judaism, because that's where I come from. When I moved to New York, I met a whole, I grew up around all this Jewish music, but when I moved to New York, I met a whole subsection of sort of a cultural, like Jewish communities that were focused much more on the cultural side of things than the religious side of things. So maybe there's like a little religious practice, but it's much more focused on, so like maybe like harkening back to like, Eastern Europe and Yiddish language and sort of the playwrights and poets and music, obviously. So like klezmer musicians. And so I met this whole subsection of people who were approaching Judaism in that way, and I found that really fascinating, just based on your question and what you were talking about. How religion, it goes. It's weird, but it and whether people will argue it, but it goes beyond sort of the religion itself and God and practice and things like that, and becomes a whole like cultural identity, and so I find it really fascinating how you can have someone who's just a super like devout in any religion, but just somebody who's super devout, practicing, letter of the scriptural law, whose Judaism is just as important to him or her as it is to the person who's, you know, completely not like, you know,
Right.
not observant of those things, but embracing the cultural side of it and the identity side of it, and the community side of it. So I find that really interesting, and I think, you know, each one has its own like validities to it. You know, I mean, I've found, you know, a place where I'm comfortable that's maybe somewhere in between.
Right.
But I just find it really interesting, and I find it can be informative to the art that is created within that too. You know, on all ends of the spectrum.
That's a great sort of jumping off point. You, like many other jazz musicians, multiple lives might not be the best way to say it, but you're constantly shifting between, I got this kind of gig one day, and then you got this kind of gig the next day. And so for you, as a jazz musician who played guitar, and we'll talk about how you came to the oud in just a minute. But for you, it's I'm sure it's interesting for you, kind of going back and forth between all of these different gigs, but then finding your own voice in your own groups as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe even more than you know. It's like the kinds of shifting that I do. I mean, and like, you know, I wouldn't admit it like a few years ago, but
right.
You know, I tried to keep all the worlds separate, and then at a certain point, I was just like, whatever. But like, you know, I do like kids' music, sing-alongs with my sister a couple times a week. I play weddings with like a religious band. I play like experimental music. You know, I'm playing sort of more world music. And so yeah, it is a lot. But I think I realized that it's I like that. You know, I think that there's obviously different directions you can go in the arts and in music. Like I know I have friends who have like really devoted themselves to, let's say, one style of music, one instrument, one thing that like is like the thing that they do. And I just think at some point I realized that I enjoy, and I think my strength is in sort of like going in these different directions and just constantly sort of like searching for new kinds of situations to put myself in and new kinds of experiences to have.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is confusing and mind tangling, and it's like literally like some days I'll have like, in the morning I'll be with like 3-year-olds, like,
right.
In the afternoon I'll be at like a Jewish wedding in Borough Park, and then at night I'll be at the Stone playing, free music. So it's like, it's an interesting life
we lead. Yeah.
What's that?
It's an interesting life we lead.
Yes, exactly.
So speaking of putting yourself in new experiences, I mean, you mentioned early on you had these cultural exposures to Jewish and Middle Eastern music, and kind of being informed by these religious melodies. So when did you pick up the oud? Well, first of all, so when did you pick up the oud, and can you tell us exactly what an oud is?
Sure. I guess I'll start with that. An oud is a stringed instrument that comes from the Middle East. I think there's sort of a debate on where it actually originated, but I believe that sort of ancient Persia is sort of a widely accepted sort of location for where it kind of, at least a predecessor to the oud, was sort of began. It has 11 strings on it generally, 5 courses of 2, and then 1 single one at the bottom. The tunings can vary based on what the music is, or which part of the world it is. And I won't get into the technicalities of that, but it's interesting because of the the general modal. Let's see. I'm trying to think of the right how to say this, because the music is generally modal, so
Right.
it's more based on melody than harmony.
Right.
So the tuning has an effect on, depending on what music you're playing, the tuning will affect, like what key it's going to be in, what strings are going to be focused on, and things like that. And let's see, it's got kind of a gourd shaped body, which helps with the projection, kind of like an acoustic guitar, but it's more rounded.
Right.
And then you asked how I got into it. So as I said, or maybe I didn't, but I grew up as a guitar player. I went to conservatory at the University of Maryland in their jazz department, and was always sort of interested in music from all over the world. But when I moved to New York, a friend of mine who is an ethnomusicologist, and his focus is in sort of North African Jewish music, asked me to join his band, which was playing some of that repertoire, and asked if I would be interested in sort of trying to pick up an oud. And I knew what it was. I didn't know much about it at the time, but I found one on Craigslist, actually, and I bought it, and I started just kind of like toying around with it. And, I learned a lot from playing with him, and meeting other people, playing that kind of music. And then eventually decided to sort of get into it more seriously, and started studying with a great teacher named Ara Dinkjian, who's just a virtuoso Armenian American oud player, and have really gotten a lot from that relationship. And and I love the study, I love the instrument, and I love the music. So
how long was the transition between you first picking up the oud and you starting to form Sandcatchers?
It was a while. I think I first picked up the oud in 2007. And Sandcatchers didn't start until, I don't know, 3 years ago. So yeah, however many years that is, 8 years, 7 years,
something like that.
Yeah,
we're musicians. We only count to 4. Not kidding.
Exactly.
So, can you tell us a little bit about this band Sandcatcher? So, just you can talk about the dudes in the band, but for those who are still learning about, who are new to Sandcatchers, it's you on oud, and then you have a lap steel, bass, and drums. So can you kind of walk us through who's in the band, how'd you decide to form it, and how you're developing rep?
Sure. So basically, the band started when I started, or I had been studying a little more seriously for a while, and actually there was a restaurant across the street from my house at the time called Cheryl's Global Soul. It was a great soul food restaurant run by a Jamaican woman named Cheryl Smith. And I approached her about sort of coming weekly to play, more as an excuse to practice than anything.
Right.
So I was like, yeah, can I just sit in the corner and work on stuff? And, and I'd been going in there for years at that point. And so she was like, yeah, totally, come in. And so I was doing that for a little while. And I was like, this would be a lot more fun if I had friends here to play with.
Right.
So Mike, the lap steel player, Mike Friedman, was living just a few blocks away, and oh, you know what? Actually, no. It started with Michael Bates, the bass player. We started sort of like putting together different ensembles and just getting together and playing duos, whatever. And then And then I called Mike because I was like, so I remember walking to the restaurant. I was like, what would be cool with oud? Like,
Yeah.
what would sound cool? And Mike and I had been doing this other project together. We were playing in someone else's group.
Mm.
I was like, wow, Mike would be great. And so I texted him. I was like, hey, do you want to come play Cheryl's? And he was like, I'll be there in 10 minutes. So that's kind of how it started. And our friend Yoni was playing, was living in the neighborhood playing drums. And so it became, we kind of, it became this sort of like hang and,
Right.
and the restaurant itself is kind of really nice. It's it's a very like community based space. Like there's a lot of people kind of from the neighborhood hanging out there and stuff. So anyway, that's kind of how things started to pick up and happen and develop. And
we'll talk.
So
We'll talk about the album in a sec here. But one thing I definitely wanted to touch on, and you mentioned, and I'm glad we had a chance to discuss this about how your life and you've kind of come to embrace that. It's just a bunch of different things, and you have to learn to navigate that, and you can't segment it, and it all kind of boils together. One thing I both really enjoyed about seeing you guys live and listening down the album is you get a lot of these different sounds throughout the album. I mean, there's some sections that are really meditative, very modal, very Middle Eastern, then you'll get some more contemporary grooving sounds. You almost get some Americana folk sounds, especially with the lap steel. And I definitely, it's a really nice synthesis. It's not what I like about what you do is it doesn't fall. There seem to me to be two distinct groups of what we can generally call fusion groups that combine multiple genres. There's the group that combines like 8 things, but each song sounds the same, or a group that combines 3 things, but then each song is one of those things. And
that's really well said.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Sandcatchers does such a nice job of finding. I mean, you mentioned about finding the middle ground in your own life. Sandcatchers does such a nice job finding a middle ground between all of that. It's fun, it's smart, and it combines a lot of different influences. So, I mean, how did you guys develop and come up with this rep? Was it all just sort of jamming? Do you write all of it out?
So I think there's kind of it's weird, but I think there's kind of an easy answer to that.
Okay.
Easy is maybe not the right word, but like when you said it, it sort of clicked on in my head.
Yeah.
So basically the way it would work is I would write a tune or a sketch or something and bring it in, and sometimes the sketch would basically stay as it was, and that would be the tune, and sometimes we would develop it a lot more. But I think the thing that you were talking about with the fusion thing, like I think because all of us, but specifically Mike and I, the lap steel player, have decided to approach our instruments and just music in general from a place that wasn't genre specific. I think that makes it so that the way that we play and the way that I write tunes and things like that just doesn't come out sounding super one thing or another. Like, I mean, Mike plays the lap steel, which, has history and Hawaiian music and Southern, like his music of the American South. But he's chosen to not approach it in that way. Like, I mean, he studied with William Parker, and is sort of creating his own language. And for me, it's like, I'm studying traditional music and I'm learning it, but it's not really the way that I approach writing.
Yeah.
So I think that because of that, like, there's nothing that's like, you're not going to hear Mike playing, licks that you would also hear, Jerry Douglas playing on the dobro,
Right.
it's just not part of his vocabulary. And so I think that that makes a difference in how the songs end up sounding.
Got it.
Um,
So the album came out. It just came out recently. I mean, you had a release party maybe about a week ago. Was that its official release?
Not even. Yeah, just a few days ago.
Oh man, that's crazy. So can you? So this is very fresh. It's kind of cool that we're really at the forefront of this, and we can get some thoughts out of it. So just to wrap this up a little bit, can you tell us about the both recording the album, the process of it, and then how your sister was involved as well? I'm definitely curious about that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, recording the album. I mean, that wasn't necessarily the most interesting story, but we great studio called Vibromonk Studios, which I'd done a little work at before. This engineer named Danny Shatsky, who's great. It's just a studio in Williamsburg that's kind of built into this loft, so it's got the right mix of great gear and sort of like an edge. It wasn't just sort of built out of nowhere. It's part of an existing space, which I really like. And one thing I really wanted to do with this record was have some kind of guest on it, a special guest, and I quickly landed on Eric Friedlander, the cellist, because we've all been huge fan of his, for me, like through my work in like the Tzaddik Records world. But just in general, I mean, he can silence a room with a solo, an hour of solo cello music, and it's incredible. So we were really excited to have him on the record. So we recorded the album there and mixed it, and that was pretty much it.
Yeah.
And you asked about my sister. So I have 3 sisters, and we're all constantly talking about different kinds of collaborations. And my sister actually spent many years on the road with a punk band called the Shondas, playing drums.
Yeah.
And only last couple of years left the band and is now in graduate school for writing. She's a brilliant poet and writer. So, all the songs that I had written kind of had working titles, but nothing really, it was a lot of like song number 1, song in 7, blah, blah, blah. And so I was like, hey, it would be really cool if like, to me and my sister would write a piece which would not only act as a piece by itself, but title the song. So to like listen to the album and kind of, be inspired to write something based on that. So that's what we did. And, that's how we got the album title and, all the song names. And so we decided to take it a step further, and she read some new work that she was doing at our album release, and it was really great.
All right. Very cool, man. Well, to end the podcast, we're gonna play a track, something off of what we found along the way by Sandcatchers. Is there anything in particular you'd like us to play?
Yeah, I think that this is the one track that was written actually before the band got together. I actually wrote this song for my wedding, for my wife to walk down the aisle.
Oh, nice.
And I had sort of put it on the shelf, and just when the band started, I was like, hey, that song would kind of sound good with this band. So it's the first track on the album, and it's called Sky Stirs.
All right. Yoshie, thanks so much for your time, brother. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Hope to see you soon.
All right.